It was the silence that got to her most in the mornings, not the kind that came from peace, but the kind that came from loss. The kind of silence that used to be filled with the scrape of toast, the hum of his radio, his whistle through the front. Yard hedges while watering the lawn before the sun got high. Now it was just her, just Helen, and the small ceramic flower pot she placed on the porch steps, navy blue with a hand-painted swirl of yellow around the rim. Inside it a cluster of white daisies and forget-me-nots, her husband Robert's favorites. She set it there the week after the funeral. Carefully, deliberately, like laying a stone at a grave. The violation notice came 3 days later. Unauthorized. Exterior ornamentation. Fine, $50 per day until removal. Helen stood in her doorway, blinking at the yellow slip taped to the screen door. The print was so aggressively official, it looked like it had been designed to intimidate. Beneath the charge, in shaky signature, was the name she already hated, Phyllis. Danbury HOA president. A woman with a clipboard addiction and a permanent scowl, Phyllis had taken over the Heatherstone Court HOA just 6 months earlier. The old board had retired, some say were quietly pushed out, and Phyllis swooped in with a new set of rules, new fines, and a smug smile that screamed, "This neighborhood is mine now." Helen, still numb from Robert's passing, had ignored the HOA meetings. Skipped them, actually. But apparently Phyllis had not ignored her. 2 days later, another fine. Then came the email, this one with 3 attached photos, one close-up of the pot, one from the sidewalk, and one, bizarrely, taken from an angle that looked like it came from the hedges across the street. Helen hadn't even seen anyone take them. This is your second notice. As per Section 3, subsection 9 of the Heatherstone Code of Ordinances, decorative items not included in the original construction or reviewed by the board are subject to removal and/or fine. You are in continued violation. Further escalation will involve legal counsel at the homeowner's expense. Legal counsel over a flower pot. Helen stared at the screen until her hands trembled. Then she walked out to the front porch and sat beside it. Just her and the pot. And the anger swelling in her chest like a second heartbeat. Across the street she spotted movement, half a face vanishing behind a lace-curtained window. Sheila Beckman, former board treasurer, gossiper-in-chief, watching, always watching, Helen. Gave a tight smile, didn't wave. The next morning the pot was gone. She saw the wet ring where it had sat, a small chip of ceramic on the porch tile. The flowers had been dumped into the soil bed, petals torn like they'd been yanked out in a rush. Her first reaction wasn't anger, it was grief, real, body-shaking, raw grief, because it felt like someone had walked into a cemetery and kicked down the headstone. Later, once the tears stopped and her breath came back, Helen walked into the garage, opened Robert's old filing cabinet, and pulled out a box labeled in sharp black marker, HOA, Legal Docs, 2003-2017. Robert had once served on the original HOA board, the old one, back before Phyllis and her cronies swooped in with their bylaws and laminated newsletters. He had spent hours going through easements and land rights. She used to joke that he took more pride in the neighborhood charter than in his own lawnmower. She opened the box. There, beneath a faded community map and a copy of the original Heatherstone agreement, she found it. A document with Robert's initials, marked in red, amendment proposal, decorative grievances clause. It was something they'd written up years ago, during a time when a neighbor's gnome collection had almost turned into a police call. The amendment allowed one decorative item not exceeding 24 inches, so long as it was respectful, and it gave exceptions for memorial displays under a personal bereavement clause. The board had passed it. She remembered Robert bringing home lemon bars from the meeting, grinning as he told her, "You can put a flamingo up if it's wearing a mourning veil." Helen's hands trembled again, but not with sadness this time, with something sharper, Steadier, something she hadn't felt in months. Resolve. She photocopied the amendment, highlighted it, typed a letter, attached a photograph of the pot and a printed copy of the violation notice. Then she slipped it into a manila envelope and mailed it, certified, to the HOA's registered attorney. 3 days later, she got an email from the HOA secretary asking if she was certain about invoking legal arbitration. Helen replied with one sentence, "I am." She didn't hear back from Phyllis, not directly, but the next day someone egged her mailbox, and that was the moment she knew this wasn't just about the pot anymore. The next HOA newsletter came folded and stuffed into every mailbox like it was a coupon flyer. A friendly reminder from your HOA board was printed in cheerful Comic Sans, but the tone was unmistakably acidic. In recent weeks, several residents have chosen to misinterpret long-standing policies regarding lawn ornamentation. While we always encourage neighborly sentiment, personal vendettas conducted through legal posturing only serve to divide our community. Helen nearly choked on her coffee. Phyllis didn't have the spine to name her directly, but the message was as clear as if she'd shown up at her door with a megaphone. She read it twice, then folded the page into a neat little square and dropped it into the recycling bin like a note from a mean girl in 7th grade. By then, word had started to spread, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quiet hush of cul-de-sac gossip. Lena from Lot 7, who always walked her golden retriever at the same time each morning, paused awkwardly on the sidewalk now. She offered Helen a pinched smile and a half-hearted wave, like she wasn't sure if Helen was a criminal or a folk hero. The real shift came at the grocery store. Helen was picking out tomatoes when she heard someone behind her say, "You're the Flowerpot lady, aren't you?" She turned slowly. A man in a faded blue polo and khakis, mid-60s maybe, with a trimmed white beard and a cart full of paper towels. "I'm sorry," she said cautiously. "The pot," he said. "The one they fined you for. My wife told me about." "Quiet, it was for your husband?" Helen nodded. "Robert." The man's face softened. "Hell of a thing what they did. We lost our son in '09. I still keep his little bike bell on the porch railing. Phyllis gave us hell for it, called it auditory clutter." Helen blinked. "She didn't. She did. Took it down herself once. I put it back up. Tied. Hid in a knot so tight it'd take bolt cutters now." He smiled faintly. "Good for you for standing up to her. Most of us just roll over." That was the moment Helen realized this wasn't personal. It was patterned. Phyllis had been waging quiet, paper-clipped war on the neighborhood, one notice at a time, counting on people being too tired, too polite, too afraid to fight back. She hadn't counted on someone like Helen, someone with nothing left to lose. Back home, Helen opened Robert's old office again, dusted off the bookshelf. She pulled every folder labeled HOA, bylaws, and correspondence. She spent hours flipping through meeting minutes, amendment proposals, zoning language, landscaping contracts. She highlighted inconsistencies, marked clauses that contradicted each other. She even found a photo of Robert shaking hands with the original HOA attorney, who, according to the print date, had retired 7 years ago, which begged the question, who exactly was the HOA using now? She checked the HOA's last few newsletters. The legal contact listed was a firm she didn't recognize, one she'd never seen during Robert's tenure. The email domain looked off. Something about it bothered her, so she did what any retired schoolteacher would do. She started making a spreadsheet. 3 nights later, someone rang her doorbell at 9:14 p.m. Helen blinked at the security monitor. Sheila Beckman. Lipstick smudged. Arms crossed. The classic stance of someone about to say, "I didn't want to be the one to tell you this." Helen opened the door. "I'm sorry for the hour," Sheila said, looking past her like the foyer might be bugged. "But you should know Phyllis is calling an emergency board meeting this week. Closed session." "Why?" Helen asked flatly. "She says it's about you." Helen tilted her head. She thinks you're stirring something, said you were digging into finances. She told the others that if they don't tighten up, the whole board could be liable. Helen didn't respond right away. Then she said, "That's interesting, isn't it?" Sheila's eyes sparkled. "Because I remember Robert mentioning that the HOA has to submit quarterly reports, but I asked for the last one last month." Phyllis said it was pending edits, which is funny because they always used to be printed and pinned to the clubhouse board. Now nothing, just potlucks and bingo nights. Helen smiled just slightly. "Thank you, Sheila." Sheila leaned in, lowering her voice. "I didn't vote for her, you know. I wanted Jim Harlan, but she bulldozed the vote with all her little proxies. Half of them were out-of-state owners who don't even live here. She always did know how to stack a room," Helen said. Then she paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you still have access to the old board group emails?" Sheila blinked. "The Gmail thread?" Helen smiled again. "Robert used to say you never delete anything." Sheila pursed her lips, then nodded. "I'll forward what I can find." That night, Helen sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, surrounded by printouts and sticky notes. Phyllis had underestimated her. Everyone had. But Helen wasn't just an old lady with a flower pot. She was a woman who'd spent 40 years teaching students how to analyze, document, and make their case under pressure, and right now, Phyllis Danbury was about to learn the lesson of her life. By the end of the week, Helen had compiled a 37-page dossier. Inside it, email chains, budget inconsistencies, missing meeting minutes, and most damning copies of checks made out to Third Horizon Property Services, a landscaping company Helen could find no online record of, except one detail. The business was registered in-state, and the name listed as the principal. Agent Derek Danbury, Phyllis's son. Helen stared at the printout for a long time. She hadn't expected the nepotism to be so direct. She'd thought maybe kickbacks, maybe preferential bids. But this was sloppy, greedy, almost arrogant. And she finally understood why the flower pot mattered so much. It was never about flowers. It was about power. Helen had challenged it, even in the quietest way, by asserting the right to remember someone. Phyllis didn't just want compliance. She wanted obedience. Helen ran her fingers over the edge of the page, then she picked up her phone. Monday morning she mailed a sealed copy of the dossier to the HOA's listed attorney, just like before. But this time she sent another copy, anonymously, to the local news tip line of Channel 8, and another to the county's Office of Consumer Affairs, CCing the Zoning and Planning Commission. She marked each envelope with a clean, handwritten label Rajori, alleged financial misconduct, Heatherstone. How she thought of Robert the whole time, how meticulous he'd been, how he used to label the sprinkler schedule binder like it was a crime scene log, how he'd hated injustice, but loved the idea that a system could be used to stop it. If you knew where to look. Use their rules, he always said. Make the truth harder to ignore. The emergency HOA meeting took place on Thursday. It wasn't supposed to be public, but that didn't stop Helen from showing up anyway. Folding chair in hand, sitting just outside the glass walls of the clubhouse like it was a courtroom gallery, she wasn't alone. 6 neighbors came with her. First was Mr. Greenwald, the one with the missing bike bell. Then Lena with the retriever. Then Sheila, smug and theatrical, carrying her own copies of the old bylaws in a vintage accordion file. By the time the meeting started, a small cluster had formed. They didn't chant or shout. They just watched through. The glass. Helen could see Phyllis pacing near the whiteboard, face red, gesturing toward a stack of papers in front of her. 3 other board members sat tight-lipped, 2 of them avoiding eye contact. At one point, someone slammed their hand on the table. Helen just sipped her thermos of tea. A few minutes later, the doors flew open. Phyllis stormed out. She didn't look at anyone, didn't say a word, just marched to her car and peeled out of the clubhouse lot with a speed unbecoming of a woman who once fined a teenager for rollerblading on the sidewalk. Helen waited. 5 more minutes passed. Then the door opened again. This time it was Jim Harlan, tall, silver-haired former firefighter and the runner-up in the last HOA board vote. He looked at Helen, then at the crowd forming behind her. He spoke softly but clearly. "We're calling for a full audit," he said, "effective immediately." Murmurs broke out. Someone clapped. Sheila whispered something that sounded like, "Finally." Jim stepped toward Helen. "And just so you know, the vote to reinstate the original bereavement clause passed." "Unanimously," Helen nodded. "I'd like to place the Flowerpot back," she said. Jim smiled. "Be my guest." The next morning at sunrise, Helen stood at her front porch. She set the navy blue pot down with both hands, gently, like setting down a memory. The daisies were fresh this time. She'd picked them herself. She stood back and took a deep breath. The air smelled like lawn clippings and morning dew. The neighborhood looked the same, but felt different, and across the street a few curtains stirred. Helen smiled. Let them watch. This time, she wasn't alone. The audit wasn't quiet. It was slow, methodical, and bloodless, but loud in the way. Silence becomes when it chokes a room that once buzzed with control. The first week, nothing happened, at least not publicly. But neighbors whispered more now. Sidewalk chat stretched longer. People asked each other questions they'd never dared to say aloud. "Didn't your landscaper quit after Phyllis pushed through that contract? Weren't we supposed to get new? Fencing around the pool last year? What happened to the reserve fund for the playground upgrades?" By the second week, someone hung a flyer on the clubhouse bulletin board that read, "Where did the money go?" Someone else added a sticky note. Beneath it, "Ask Derek." It was torn down by noon. But Helen had seen it. The HOA lawyer, an anxious young man who clearly hadn't expected to be part of a scandal involving mulch kickbacks and proxy vote rigging, sent Helen a letter that said, in polished legalese, essentially, "We acknowledge receipt of your materials. We are reviewing the contents in coordination with the board and will respond formally pending the outcome of the third-party audit." Helen taped it to the fridge like a child's art project. Underlined "acknowledge." Robert would have laughed. It wasn't until the third week that the news hit, a short segment on the local Channel 8 evening broadcast. Helen didn't even know the camera crew had come, until she flipped channels. Mid-dinner and saw her own front porch on screen. A dispute over a flower pot has uncovered deeper tensions inside the Heatherstone HOA. They didn't name Phyllis outright, but they did say, "The HOA president has not responded to multiple requests for comment." They showed footage of the clubhouse, a tight zoom on the bulletin board, an anonymous source's quote about financial discrepancies and non-competitive contracts. By the end of the segment, Helen's phone had buzzed 6 times. 2 were from numbers she didn't know. One was Sheila. "You're famous. You look good in profile." The last one, though, made Helen pause. It was a voicemail from Derek Danbury. "Hi, to Mrs. Langford. This is Derek, Phyllis's son. I know we've never met, but listen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This landscaping thing, it's not... Anyway, I'd really appreciate it if we could maybe talk just to clear things up. Call me back if you're willing." She didn't call back. She forwarded it to the HOA board instead. That weekend, a neighborhood kid left a drawing on Helen's porch. Crayons on construction paper, a stick figure woman beside a blue flower pot. Above it, the words in shaky block letters, "You won." Helen stared at it for a long moment, then smiled. She hadn't won yet. Not really. But something had shifted. Something no board meeting or fine could reverse. The silence that had wrapped Heatherstone like a fog, that dull, afraid hush everyone lived under, was breaking. And Helen quietly and deliberately kept the pressure on. Monday morning, the HOA issued its first formal memo in nearly 2 months. It read, "Effective immediately, HOA President Phyllis Danbury is stepping down to focus on personal matters. An interim board will be established pending the conclusion of the independent financial review. All decorative violation fines issued from March to May will be voided and refunded. We appreciate your patience and commitment to community values." Helen read it twice, then poured herself a small glass of wine. Outside, the neighborhood was unusually alive. Kids on bikes, dogs barking, porch lights on. It felt like a different street, one where people weren't afraid to look each other in the eye, but Helen didn't gloat. Instead, she walked outside, clipped a single daisy from her pot, and placed it in a mason jar on the front step. A quiet thank you to Robert, to herself, to the fire she didn't know she still carried. The war might be cooling down, but Helen hadn't told everything she knew. Not yet. The refund came in the form of a check, $600, stapled to a folded letter from the interim board. It was accompanied by a note that said, "This reimbursement represents the reversal of decorative violation fines accrued between March 7 and April months. 3. The board acknowledges the hardship caused and expresses our regret." Helen stared at it. $600. For daring to grieve with daisies. For daring to be seen. She didn't cash it. Not yet. Instead, she pinned it to the corkboard in Robert's old office, right beside the copy of the bereavement clause he had written in 2005. It sat like a trophy, not of money, but of principle. It could have ended there. Most people would have let it. But Helen knew how rot worked. You don't stop when the branch breaks. You dig until you find the roots. 2 weeks after Phyllis's resignation, the audit results were released. Not publicly yet, but a printed copy was quietly slipped under each homeowner's door. Helen found hers early that morning. It was sealed in a plain white envelope labeled Heatherstone HOA Audit Summary Report. She read it 3 times, then she put on her shoes. The board called a community forum that evening. Not in the clubhouse, but in the Heatherstone Elementary Auditorium, which hadn't been used for a meeting since the neighborhood's founding picnic. Fold-out chairs, mic stands, a dusty podium. Over 80 residents showed up. People brought notebooks, clipboards. Some brought anger, others brought hope. Helen sat in the second row, calm and ready. At 6:05 p.m., Jim Harlan stepped up to the mic. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, held up the audit summary in one hand and a stack of receipts in the other. "The investigation has revealed the following," he began. Over the past 14 months, the HOA board, under President Phyllis Danbury, approved a series of payments to Third Horizon Property Services totaling over $93,000. No bids were received from alternate vendors. No contracts were signed in accordance with HOA procurement policy, and no services were performed in the final 6 months of that agreement, despite payments continuing monthly. Gasps, murmurs, shuffling, whispers of, "I knew it," and she said the budget was tight. Jim continued. "Further, it has come to our attention that the board failed to document meeting minutes for at least 9 official sessions, including 3 that approved major expenditure increases. This is a violation of both our bylaws and the State Homeowners Association Act." He paused, took a breath. The board also imposed selective enforcement of decorative fines, over 80% of which were issued to residents in a 6-home radius around President Danbury's property. Most of those recipients were either elderly new homeowners or families with foreign surnames. That silence, cold, tight, and deadly quiet, hung heavier than any gasp. Helen watched the room stiffen like it had been slapped. Across the aisle, Mrs. Patel sat straight-backed and motionless, her hands clenched in her lap. Helen remembered the tiny lanterns she used to hang during Diwali, gone now. Taken down the same week Phyllis passed her seasonal decor restrictions policy. Jim folded the papers, looked out at the crowd. We are, as a board, ashamed, but we are also determined to correct this. A single clap rang out, then another, and another. After the meeting, Helen stayed seated as the crowd trickled out. People lingered, some came to thank her. Others just nodded as they passed. One man pressed her hand gently in both of his and said, "You gave us back our voice." Helen just smiled. She didn't need thanks. She needed change, and now, finally, it was happening. The next morning, she returned to her routine. Tea on the porch, a quiet check of the flower pot. But there was something new there now. A second pot. Not navy, not daisies. This one was hand-painted, terracotta with marigolds blooming wildly from the rim. There was a little card tucked in the soil. For Robert, and for all of us, thank you, Helen. Lot 12. She sat down, and for the first time in months she cried. Not out of grief, but out of community, out of belonging, out of the fierce, unshakable knowledge that the silence had been broken, and it would never return. The county letter came on a Wednesday, cream envelope, thick paper, embossed seal. It was addressed to Mrs. Helen Langford, and the moment she saw the return address, Office of the County Compliance Auditor, she knew. She slit it open with the silver letter opener Robert had given her on their 20th anniversary. Inside, a 3-paragraph letter confirming that an official inquiry had been opened into potential misuse of community funds, failure to disclose familial business connections, and violations of county-level HOA governance statutes. It concluded, "We thank you for your documented report and supporting materials. You may be contacted for further clarification." She read it twice, then carefully tucked it into a labeled folder in her file cabinet. HOA, External Inquiries. Across the room, the flower pot sat in the sunlight on the window ledge, flanked now by 3 others, gifts each one. The neighborhood had become something unexpected, alive. Front yards that had been sterile copies of one another now held little touches of individuality. A ceramic owl, a wind chime, a bird bath carved from stone, lawn chairs on porches, tea shared between neighbors who hadn't spoken in years. It was subtle, but it was spreading, but not everyone liked it. The letter from Phyllis came a week later, folded in a plain envelope. No return address, just the name scrawled in blocky. Pen to Helen, the handwriting was tight, angular, controlled. "You think you won, but all you've done is stir trouble. There are rules for a reason. Neighborhoods aren't meant to be playgrounds for emotion. I tried to maintain order. That pot wasn't just a pot. It was the first crack. You let things slip once and it all unravels. You'll see. It always does. No signature, no apology, just that thin, cold sermon." Helen didn't react, didn't call the board, didn't wave the letter around. Instead, she slid it into a folder labeled Correspondence Hostile. She wasn't rattled. She was ready. That Saturday, Helen attended her first open-board community planning session in years. The room was full. Not just the regulars, but newcomers, renters, older residents who'd never felt invited before. There was laughter. There were ideas. Jim Harlan presented a draft for a community values amendment, meant to prioritize transparency, neighbor input, and inclusivity. It would restrict unilateral decision-making by board presidents and require quarterly financial disclosures. When he asked if anyone wanted to help write it, 6 hands went up. Helen's was first. They met every other Tuesday at her kitchen table. Tea flowed. So did cookies. So did stories. That's when the neighbors began to truly talk. Mr. Alvarez from Lot 18 shared that Phyllis once fined his daughter for having a pink umbrella on the balcony, said it clashed with the exterior paint code. She was 11 at the time. She cried for 2 days. Mrs. Patel revealed she'd been told in front of others that Diwali decorations sent the wrong message to newcomers. Lena confessed she was once threatened with legal action over a handmade welcome home banner. For her husband's return from surgery, all of them had stayed quiet until now. Each story, small on its own, wove into a larger tapestry. Phyllis hadn't been a bad apple. She'd been a rotted root, demanding uniformity, silencing difference, wrapping her control in the language of preservation. In late June, the county sent a second letter. It was brief but decisive. The Heatherstone HOA has been found in violation of County Code 14.5 regarding failure to disclose business ties and selective enforcement. Sanctions will include board, member disqualifications, and the appointment of a temporary external mediator. At the bottom, Danbury, Phyllis, permanently barred from holding HOA office or serving in advisory capacity. Helen folded the letter carefully and placed it in the center of the kitchen table. A single word passed her lips softly. Good. But even that wasn't the last page. One morning in July, as Helen sipped her tea and watched a butterfly land on her flowerpot, she spotted movement near the corner of the street. A moving truck, big, grey, no logo. She stepped outside. Phyllis, hair shorter, jacket wrinkled. Sunglasses on, she didn't speak. She walked from her porch to the truck without a glance back. Behind her, a hired team rolled boxes from the porch, each labeled with cold corporate Sharpie. Office. Board records. Decor. As she climbed into the cab, she turned once. Not at Helen, at the pot. Then looked away like it hurt. The truck pulled out slowly. No one waved. No one followed. No one said goodbye. Helen didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply turned back to her porch, sat down in the chair Robert built, and exhaled into the morning air. The neighborhood had been reclaimed, not by rage or by rebellion, but by truth and memory and the power of being quietly, persistently right. And the flowerpot? It stayed. By August, Heatherstone Court didn't just look different, it felt different. Wind chimes danced across porches. Lawn chairs didn't match. There were handmade signs for birthdays, homecomings, and one spontaneous backyard jazz night that turned the cul-de-sac into a summer lounge lit by string lights and citronella candles. For the first time in years, the HOA newsletter was written in plain language, not veiled threats. It had a welcome section, a community spotlight, and a hand-drawn border of sunflowers by the Rodriguez twins in Lot 8. At the bottom of the front page was a new announcement. Nominations open for HOA board elections. Helen stared at it, then folded the page slowly and set it down. She didn't expect what came next. First came Jim Harlan. He showed up on a Sunday with a peach cobbler and a manila envelope. Inside it, the nomination form, already filled out with her name, just waiting for her signature. "I'm too old," Helen said, smiling. Jim laughed. "You just took down a dictator with a flower pot and a spreadsheet. I'd say you're just hitting your prime." Then came Lena, the woman with the golden retriever. Then Mrs. Patel, then the retired couple from Lot 14, who'd never spoken much before, now offering to help with yard signs. They didn't beg. They just believed. And that did something to Helen, something deep, something steadying. She signed the form. One evening, as she was organizing her paperwork for the campaign, she returned to Robert's old filing box, the one where this entire story began. She reached past the thick stack of bylaws, under an old community directory, and felt something strange beneath the flap, a loose folder, one she'd missed. Inside, handwritten notes, yellowed newspaper clippings, a sketch of a floor plan, and at the top, H. Park, Proposed Plan 2006. She frowned. She remembered the name. Helen Park, named after the subdivision, not her. A patch of grass behind the clubhouse, long abandoned. It had once been promised as a community space, a memorial garden. There were even talks of adding benches, a gazebo, maybe a walking trail. But then the funds disappeared. The land sat fenced off and empty, labelled not for use under review. Helen hadn't thought about it in over a decade, but there it was, a plan, a budget, a drawing of daisy-lined paths and a bronze plaque that read, "For those we remember." For those we love. Robert's handwriting was neat, thoughtful, dated just 2 weeks before the board quietly cancelled the park altogether. Helen flipped to the last page, a single note, in Robert's pen. If this is buried, it's not because it can't be done. It's because someone didn't want it seen. The next day she called Jim, then she called Sheila, then she made one more call, to a woman she hadn't spoken to since the audit began. Sandra Ellis, the assistant from the County Parks and Rec. Board. Within days, a site visit was approved. The land was still HOA property, but Helen knew the bylaws now better than most attorneys. With a 2-3 resident vote, any common ground could be repurposed if it was done transparently. They scheduled a town vote, and Helen did something Phyllis never had the courage to do. She knocked on every door. She told the story about the memorial park, the proposal that vanished, the pot that started everything. She showed the plans, let people hold them in their hands, let them imagine something better. The vote passed, unanimously, not a single hand raised in protest. And on the day the fence was finally removed from the land behind the clubhouse, Helen stood quietly, her hand resting on the navy-blue flower pot. She had brought with her not to protest this time, but to plant. They broke ground with shovels and laughter and cameras and hugs. The new park would take time, but it would be built, and the plaque Robert had once drafted would stand. Only now, it would say, "For those we remember, for those we love, for the voice that stood when others stayed silent." Helen Langford didn't just win a seat on the board. She won something deeper. She restored the soul of a place that had once told her to be quiet, pay her fine, and take her memories inside. And she had one more thing planned. Because Phyllis may have left, but her shadow still lingered. In old files, in contractor receipts, in names and quiet agreements, Helen wasn't done digging into. Autumn came to Heatherstone with a golden hush. The air grew crisp, the sidewalks shimmered with curled leaves, and the new park behind the clubhouse began to take shape. Concrete paths were laid. Children ran loops around newly installed benches. A gazebo went up in the center, painted soft, sage green to match the neighborhood's earliest design palette. Neighbors donated bulbs, bricks, paint, and time. Even the grumpiest residents found themselves pulling weeds with soft smiles. But Helen wasn't finished. Not yet. She'd won the election in a landslide, more ballots than anyone in Heatherstone's history. Jim Harlan stayed on as treasurer. Sheila Beckman, in a twist no one saw coming, became the new secretary and proved surprisingly adept at organizing people when her energy was directed away from gossip. But Helen's first act as HOA president wasn't ceremonial. It was an audit of the HOA's vendor contracts, every last one from the past 10 years. It took weeks. The board hired an outside consultant. They found nothing major at first, just laziness, favoritism, and a paper trail of bad bookkeeping. All things they could correct until the last file, the one Helen found buried under Historical Vendor Index. It was labeled Pine Grove. Instruction, Retainer Project, H. Park, 2006. She sat at her kitchen table, glasses perched on her nose, and turned the page. One invoice. Signed and paid $15,000 initialed by Phyllis Danbury. It was dated 3 days after Robert's proposal was denied. The payment wasn't for a demolition or construction service. It was labeled Land Evaluation and Fill. Helen stared at it. Fill. She called Jim. Then she called the county assessor's office. Then 3 days later, she stood at the edge of the new park as a contractor with a soil probe drove a 3-foot spike into the grassy field and hit something hard. They unearthed it. Slowly, a flat concrete slab buried just inches below the surface. Not large, maybe the size of a dining table. And beneath it, an old iron box. Inside the box, rolls of blueprints, sealed budget drafts, and a folder marked H. Park, Phase 2 in Robert's neat handwriting. And one more thing. A letter. Addressed simply, to whom it may concern, especially Helen. She read it at the kitchen table in the chair he'd once stained with spilled coffee and late-night law books. If you're reading this, someone decided a park wasn't worth the trouble. That's all right. It doesn't mean we failed, it just means the fight is waiting for someone else. And if that someone is you, Helen, then I guess I always knew you'd finish what I started. You always did have more courage than me. This space matters, because people deserve places to grieve, to gather, to grow. You're not just defending flowers, you're defending what connects us. Keep going, even if it's hard, especially then. I love you. R. Her hands trembled, but she didn't. Cry, she smiled. Then she called the board. They voted to install the letter, laminated and framed beneath the new park's dedication plaque, so that everyone who sat in its shade, who watched children play, who visited to think or pray or heal, would know this place existed because one woman refused to move a flower pot. On the day of the ribbon cutting, the entire neighborhood gathered. Some wore suits. Others wore overalls and gardening gloves. Lena's dog wore a bow tie. Kids ran barefoot in the grass. Jim gave a speech. Sheila gave an overlong one. Then Helen stepped to the mic. She didn't speak about bylaws or audits. She spoke about memory, about Robert, about how easy it is to forget that power, when unchecked, becomes cruelty cloaked in order, about how rules without empathy are just a slow erosion of kindness. She ended with one sentence. Don't let quiet people be ignored, and don't let loud ones be obeyed just because they shout. They applauded. They cheered. And when Helen stepped down from the podium, she walked straight to the navy blue flower pot that had been placed at the front of the stage. She knelt, dug a small hole, and planted a fresh cluster of daisies with her own hands. When she stood, the crowd followed. Behind her, a line formed: marigolds, lilies, wild roses, small pots painted by children, seeds pressed gently into the earth. One by one, the cracks that had once divided Heatherstone were filled, not with silence but with color.